Before going to the main topic, let us see first the overview topics for today's video. Reporters are going to tackle about Acuña's philosophical analysis. Unit 3, Module 1, the subject matter of formal deductive logic. Unit 4, Module 1, the subject matter of informal logic. And lastly, the Unit 4, Module 2, the theory of argument. Unit 3, Module 1, the subject matter of formal deductive logic. The subject matter of formal deductive logic, or FDL, has been defined in numerous ways, depending upon the temper of the logician. Nevertheless, the most common denominator among these definitions is that FDL, or the formal deductive logic, is a study of valid and invalid argument forms. The formal logicians believe they have found the essence of all arguments in its argument form. They strip the content of all naturally occurring arguments in ordinary discourse by representing them and simply concentrate on their logical form, and judge whether the argument form is valid or invalid. Consider a simple but typical deductive argument on the right side of the presentation. As you can see in the first statement, if Philo is a puppy, then Philo is a young dog. In the second statement, Philo is a puppy. In the third statement, therefore Philo is a young dog. The structure of this argument is composed of two premises, namely statements 1 and 2, while the conclusion is the statement 3. The minimum requirement for a deductive argument is at least one premise and one conclusion. It doesn't matter how many premises you have. If you only have one conclusion, you have only one argument. It was also said that the premise or premises and the conclusion of the argument are either true or false only. They obey the principle of excluded middle. This principle states that a statement can only have two truth values, either it is true or it is false and nothing else. The representation of logical structure, as you can see in the lower right side of the presentation, is in vertical mode. To wit, first, if P then Q, second, P, third, therefore Q. Once the argument is represented, you reveal its logical structure, but you strip it of its content. Philo and Poppy disappeared from consideration. Now you can inspect the argument form of the argument by presenting its truth table. The argument form of this argument is named modus ponens, and all arguments with its argument form are valid. Notice that the content of the premises and conclusion is not that important in the determination of validity. And when an argument is valid, this means that in all substitution instances of its truth value, you will not have a case where the premise set is true and the conclusion is false. And if you do have that, the argument form is invalid. Continuation of logical structure. In contrast, modus ponens has a corresponding invalid argument form. It is called affirming the consequent. To wit, first statement, if Philo is a puppy, then Philo is a young dog. Second statement, Philo is a young dog. Third statement, therefore Philo is a puppy. And we represent the argument structure in this way. First, if P then Q. Second, Q. Third, therefore P. This argument form, called affirming the consequent, is invalid whatever is the content of the argument. This means that if we get the truth table of the argument form above, it has a combination that indicates the premise set is true and the conclusion false. Definition of a deductive argument. A deductive argument is a type of reasoning made up of a premise or a premise set, and a conclusion such that in all possible substitution instances of the truth values of the premises and conclusion, you will not have a case in its truth table where the premise set is true and the conclusion false. This means that the argument form is valid. If you do, then the argument form is invalid. To give points on the statement in the presentation, this means that if the premise or premises is true and the conclusion is false, the argument form is invalid. It was also said that all other possible combination of truth values of the premise set and the conclusion, the argument form is valid. So if the premise set is false, the conclusion can be either true or false, and the argument form remains valid. And if the conclusion is true, the premise set can be either true or false, and the argument form remains valid. It was also said that to be invalid argument, the premise set must be true and the conclusion must be false, so that the argument form is invalid. A valid argument form has no combination of truth values where the premise set is true and the conclusion is false. This type of argument is called a tautology. An argument where the premise set is false and the conclusion false is still valid. In fact, some formal logicians substitute the symbol 1 for true and 0 for false precisely, to avoid the usual empirical meaning attached to the terms true and false. Essence of deductive arguments. Kant arrogantly claims, logic is deductive, reasoning is valid or invalid. This applies, as my own treatment illustrates, even to probability inference, which is strictly deductive in form. Induction is better thought of as guesswork, the formulation of a hypothesis to be tested in accordance with strict canons of reasoning. To give point again on the statement in the presentation, formal logicians have moved away from the study of arguments in its natural setting, which is ordinary language. They are not interested in the empirical or evaluated content of the premises and conclusion of your arguments. So formal logicians are concerned with the valid and invalid argument forms only, and they found what are they looking for in the concept of argument form. And an argument form is either valid or invalid. There are no degrees of validity. In the language of one logician, this standard of validity or invalidity is applicable to any and all possible worlds. Formal logic can teach us how to identify a valid argument and avoid an invalid argument form. Invalid arguments are called formal fallacies. Formal logic was not intended to help us understand different types of arguments that occur in natural languages. Popularizers of formal logic were guilty of attempting to encroach upon the domain of argumentation in ordinary discourse. This is the subject matter of informal logic. Deductive logic is a formal science, not unlike mathematics, and like all formal sciences, it has no empirical content. Its principles are normative and not descriptive. When we say that the arguments of formal logic are normative, we mean that logic does not describe the way people actually compose arguments. So logic is not a descriptive science, rather is a normative science. This means that formal logic prescribes how to compose valid arguments and how to avoid composing invalid ones, because if the principles of logic are not observed, then invalid arguments form result. Unit 4, Module 1, the subject matter of informal logic. We have discovered in Module 1 of Unit 3 that the subject matter of formal deductive logic is tight, precise, and well demarcated. In contrast, the subject matter of informal logic is the content of the argument that formal logic discards when an argument is represented and the logical form is inspected. According to the statement made by Govier in what you see in the presentation is that, in here, informal logicians study arguments in their natural setting, like arguments that occur in ordinary discourse. It was said that real arguments in natural language are not capable of completely precise treatment. It deals with controversial topics, controversial facts, plausible hypotheses, and almost correct analogies. To assess them, we need to clear up ambiguities, see how different factors fit together, weigh the pros and cons, consider the credibility of those we depend on for credibility and expertise. Formal logic is inherently incapable of addressing such questions. At best, it will be applied to a natural language argument after practically all the interesting questions about interpretation, content, and substantive truth that it contains have been resolved. Informal logic suggests identifying, understanding, analyzing, and evaluating arguments as they appear in the context of speeches in everyday conversations, discussions, controversies, and even debates, without the paradigm of logical form as a model. Analysis of the content of the argument. Let us provide a good example in order to highlight the subject matter of informal logic. Let us consider an invalid argument form called affirming the consequent and provide it with content, to wit: first, if it rains, Angat Dam will be full. Second, Angat Dam is full. Third, therefore it rained. From the standards of formal logic, the argument form in the left is invalid, and all argument with this logical structure is said to be invalid whatever the content. But if you analyze the content of the argument, you will notice that the claim of conclusion, which is the statement 3, it rained, is supported by the two premises 1 and 2, is quite strongly. Let us consider the valid form of modus ponens. First, if it rains, Angat Dam will be full. Second, it rained. Third, therefore Angat Dam is full. The argument form may be valid, but if you analyze the content of the argument, The conclusion 3, Angat Dam is full, does not necessarily follow the two premises 1 and 2, for the simple reason that the rains may not be strong enough to fill up the dam. This argument does not fit the definition of copy. He means that in the valid form, you cannot offer the two premises 1 and 2 as grounds for or reason for believing the conclusion. Because if you do, then the conclusion will not follow from the premises. Whereas in the invalid form, if Angat Dam is full, you know with certainty that it rained even you have not observed the rain. Hence, it is in the invalid form of affirming the consequent, where the two premises 1 and 2 can be used as grounds for or reason for believing the conclusion.
Ito pa yung ibang counter-examples. The examples that you will be seeing are still part of fallacy of affirming the consequent or converse error. Again, this fallacy is assuming that the opposite of valid conditional statement is also valid. You can see the 3 examples below na pagtitignan medyo acceptable naman yung premises pero hindi pa pala. Actually, para sa akin, sobrang strong na ng premises niya or sobrang strong na ng evidence niya. For example A, I'm not really sure why it isn't acceptable up until now since for me, okay na talaga siya. Pero naisip ko na baka dahil kulang pa yung premise to come up with the conclusion. If susundin natin yung conditional statement na if P, then Q, it is P, therefore it is Q. So gagamitin natin yung example na if a figure is triangle, then it is a geometric figure with 3 sides and 3 angles. And with this premise na it is a triangle, therefore yung conclusion na it has 3 sides and 3 angles, which is kind of acceptable for me kasi isa yun sa mga magde-define sa triangles. Sa triangle, except kapag binaliktad natin and make it a converse statement like sa example na nakikita nyo ngayon. Ang 3 sides and 3 angles ay masyadong general properties for me. We can add up pa some more premise to support the triangle instead. Sa letter B naman, yung the fact na magko-conclude ka na na-bachelor isang lalaki just because he is an unmarried male is not acceptable. Nag-search ako on what does it really mean for someone to be considered as a bachelor. Kasi given na yung unmarried male talaga. Yung definition na yon is the most common definition of a bachelor. Being a bachelor is more than of being an unmarried male. Ang bachelor ay ang unmarried male na may potential na magpakasal or being married in his status. Papaano yung mga batang lalaki? Papaano yung mga male babies? Papaano din yung mga pare? They are all unmarried males. Does that mean that they are also bachelors? Hindi naman. For letter C, for a puppy to be considered as a puppy, kailangan below 1-year-old yung aso, based on Google. Yes, it is true na ang puppy ay young dog, but something is off pag pinagbaligtad sila. Not all the time na kapag young dog ay puppy na. Since isang patunay na sometimes nagingipin yung aso, ibig sabihin bata or young pa yung dog. Since nagingipin siya, pero di na siya puppy since nagpas na siya ng 1-year-old. Let's put it in a simpler way. Ang puppy ay yung child and let's say, or baby. Lahat ng children or babies ay nasa murang edad or young pa, pero hindi lahat ng nasa murang edad pa ay considered as a child or a baby. Let's say for example, bata pa yung nagngingipin, like nag-start minsan ng 5 or 6 years old pero hanggang 13 years old ang paggingipin ng isang bata o ng isang tao. Even if pasok na siya sa 10 years, which is 13, pero hindi siya pa pwedeng i-consider na bata. Kasi pasok na siya sa teen. So, I hope naintindihan nyo, pero yun nga, though bata siya, hindi siya parang considered sa gantong classification ng age. Kunyari, young siya, pero hindi siya considered sa classification ng baby. Or kunyari, teen siya, pero hindi siya kasama sa classification ng children. Mga ganon. So what is an informal logic? According to Johnson, by informal logic, I mean to designate a branch of logic whose task is to develop non-formal standards, criteria, procedures for the analysis, interpretation, evaluation, criticism, and construction of argumentation in everyday discourse. Dito sinasabi na lahat ng example na na-mention from above are confirmed by the truth in a non-deductive way or generalizing that something is true based from the premises na naipresent. Non-deductive way is measuring of how strong or weak the premises are. Hindi katulad ng deductive way na sinusukat ang premises kung valid ba ito or invalid. Meaning, dalawa lang pinamimilian sa deductive way. True or false. It's either true or false. Sinasabi din ni Sir Acuna na kinoconsider niya yung arguments na na-mention from above as analytic because claims of conclusions are supported by mere analysis of the meanings of the subject and predicate of the premises and conclusion. So, basic issues in informal logic. So, dito sinasabi ni Sir Acuna na informal logicians are still debating what is the meaning of an argument or how something can be called an argument. Ayaw din nila ng traditional model of presenting an argument, which is premise set, plus logical inference, and plus conclusion. And some may even believe that deductive arguments are not genuine arguments at all, as they are only inference and not an argument. They are also debating how many types or typology of arguments there are. Informal logicians are still finding or learning on how a premises will be related and relevant to a conclusion, as they are still in search for a theory of premise relevance, meaning naghahanap pa sila ng criteria kung kailan nga ba masasabi na ang premise or an argument is relevant or argumentative. Third, sinasabi din ni Sir Acuna na sundin natin si Sir Wittgenstein na to look and see but don't think, or to perceive but not to judge. And yan ang common mistake ng formal logicians, na they are after the validity of an argument. If it is true or valid, then they would accept it as an argument. And if not, or it is merely confirmed in a non-deductive way, then it would be rejected and tagged as a counterfeit arguments, without even thinking kung may sense ba or wala yung premise or argument, or how weak or strong ba tong mga to. Lastly, we should also use the familiar resemblance of traits and be language game specific. Meaning, hindi dapat tayo magkaroon ng preconceived ideas in mind when approaching an argument dahil bawat argument ay language game specific, different situation and different arguments. So in this part, it will provide us a theory of argument made up of the theory of analysis and theory of appraisal. The theory of argument. It is an acquisition of a step-by-step procedure in order to impart a set of analytic skills for composing an argument, including metacognitive skill of criticizing an argument and metacognitive skill of evaluating the strengths of both original argument and the counter-argument. So, sinasabi dito na composing an argument is an acquisition of step-by-step procedure with an aim na makareach sa metacognitive skill or metacognition or pagiging aware sa process ng pagbuo ng argument and yung pattern na ginawa before having that argument. So, in order to reach the metacognition, we need to also prepare the counter-arguments of the argument that we made. Ralph Johnson's model of theory of argument. In order to remain within the mainstream of the language game of informal logicians, Sir Acuna proposed to sketch a theory using Ralph Johnson's model of theory of argument. So, theory of argument must have two components, including theory of appraisal and theory of analysis. Theory of analysis, which is pluralistic, meaning ang pluralistic has more than one ultimate principle. Its task is to provide answer to how an argument is to be defined, what is the purpose of the argument, and how many types of argument are there. The next component is the theory of appraisal. It is a multivalent, means having more than one meaning, interpretation, or perspective. It provides answer to how should an argument be evaluated and criticized? How do we determine whether a premise is relevant or not? And what are the appropriate standards for measuring argument strength? Dito makikita niyo sa kaliwa yung bird's eye view ng theory of argument. Theory of argument divided into two components, theory of analysis and theory of appraisal. Theory of analysis divided into three parts, definition, typology, and purpose. Typology divided into three parts, analytic, empirical, and evaluative. Theory of appraisal divided into two parts, evaluation and criticism. Evaluation focuses on the strength and weakness, while the criticism focuses only to the weakness. So, under ng theory of analysis, what is an argument? So, in analytic definition, given sa slide ko ano yung definition ng argument, pero ito yung parang precise definition niya. Ang argument is any discourse, whether oral or written, that are used as reason, justification, or evidence to support another statement's claim. What is the purpose of an argument? So he agreed with other informal logicians in the purpose of an argument, quotation included in the slide, but to simplify, argument will be considered successful if it has achieved its intended goal. Conclusion is accepted on the basis of the premises offered, and as a critical thinker, it is our obligation to accept or reject a conclusion based on the strength of the premises offered. How many types of argument are there? Sinabi ni Sir Acuna na it is very difficult to answer with finality if how many types of arguments there are, since some of it are only temporary kasi types of argument varies sa mga language games na present sa every argument. Therefore, he chose to present types of argument from epistemological perspective from point of view of the three types of epistemic claims, namely empirical, analytic, and evaluative. Number 1, empirical argument. It is something that is empirically true, false, or probable. It may be an opinion, belief, or knowledgeable claim. So yung binigay na example is something about generalization. From the characteristic of a sample, it would be applied to the characteristic of the population. Example, most politicians are corrupt because all the politicians I'm acquainted with are all corrupt. Dahil sa mga nakasalumuhan niyang corrupt na official, which is a sample, nag-conclude siya na lahat ng officials ay corrupt, which is the population. Number 2, analytic argument. Supported by an analytic definition or well-formed of some formal science. So ito yung parang gumagamit ng argument and nagbe-base ng conclusion based on scientifically or mathematically proven. Example, this piece of land must be a triangle because it contains 3 sides and 3 angles. Supported by the analytic definition, all triangles have 3 sides and 3 angles. Number 3, evaluative argument. So nakafocus siya sa act, behavior, or if an event is good or bad, right or wrong, moral or immoral, desirable or undesirable, basta evaluative. Example, it is morally wrong to torture a human being for fun because this is a violation of his or her human right. Every human being should be treated with respect and dignity. There is no known society or culture in the world that will sanction the torture of a human being for fun. We speak of reasons justifying the claim of conclusion. So dito ginamit niya yung morality and yung right niya ng isang human being as an evidence. Theory of appraisal. So yung basic aim ng theory na to is to provide the criteria that will measure the strength of support offered by the premise or premises to the claim of conclusion. In order to evaluate the strength, some questions must be asked. What is the nature of the claim of the conclusion? Is it analytic, empirical, or evaluative? What is the required evidence or justification to prove the claim of the conclusion? So a good theory of appraisal must be able to sort out the various kinds of epistemic claims and determine the required evidence to establish the claim. Or sinasabi na we should know how to sort out different epistemic claims that will be needed as an evidence to support a certain claim. B. Provide the criteria for estimating the epistemic force of reason or reasons, evidence that supports different types of claims. Or magpro-provide ng criteria ng reason or evidence kung ano ba yung i-reject or i-accept mo that will be used to support a certain claim. Dito, sinasabi lang na if yung premise set coincide with the required evidence, yung argument magiging conclusive, and that is what we should look for. And the closer you are to the required evidence, the stronger the argument. Katulad ng example about corrupt politicians, the claim will be true if 50% plus 1 ng population ay corrupt. Population ng politicians. But how do we determine whether a premise is relevant or not? If it can verify, or confirm, or justify the claim of the conclusion. Next, what are the appropriate standards for measuring argument strength? Number 1, the criteria for judging the strength of an empirical argument. It is measured by the evidence offered by premise to verify the truth or probability of the conclusion. It is also a strength of relation between premises and conclusion may be susceptible to degrees. Example, more likely than that, Isabel comes from a poor family because Isabel is a UP freshman batch 1998 and most freshman batch 1998 come from poor families. So yung evidence na provide niya is mostly ng freshman batch ng 1998 come from poor families and it is only the measure of the probability if it is true or not. Letter B, the criteria for judging the strength of an analytic argument. Rest on the stability of the truth of the analytic statement, analytic definition or well-formed formula of some formal science. It is not susceptible to degrees. Example, eagles have feathers and all animals with feathers are birds. Therefore, all eagles are birds. And yon, gumamit siya ng formal science as evidence to support his claim. So third and last, the criteria for judging the strength of an evaluative argument rest on the extent of public acceptance on intersubjective consensus regarding the moral principle offered to justify an evaluative claim. The relationship between premise and conclusion is loose and susceptible to variations from different audience, since audience have also different moral principle and perspective. For example, Pedro should not be punished. Although he is accused of a crime, he is innocent, and we should never punish an innocent person. So some may believe in their moral perspective na inocente si Pedro, but some are not, so the strength of evidence depends on the audience. Again, I'm Linea Jadera, together with my partner Champsave Valenzuela, and that ends our presentation in philosophy about analysis of deductive arguments and analysis of natural arguments. Thank you for tuning in.